The differential housing in front of us has suffered a crack, making installing the internal bearings properly impossible. Replacing it with a new one would cost 20,000 rupees, but the mechanic in Pakistan is ready to repair it instead. They can restore the broken housing to full functionality with simple welding and lathe work. Since the truck had already broken down by the roadside, the owner drove 10 kilometers to bring the part directly to a professional repair shop in Karachi to avoid delaying the delivery. The crack in the differential housing was in the weakest part of the internal structure, which affected the proper installation of the guide bearing. However, this repair is easy for the mechanic and can be completed for just 2,000 rupees. After the mechanic skillfully cleaned the lubricant off the part, the bearing retaining ring remained intact, and the fractured surfaces could be perfectly aligned. The mechanic's first step was to tack weld the retaining ring into its original position using a welding rod. To restore the ring's original strength, the mechanic chose an E7018 welding rod, known for its hardness and flexibility, to prevent any future fractures at the weld. Once the retaining ring's position was confirmed to be correct, the high temperature from the welding process caused some misalignment, so the mechanic used a clamp to reduce the gap before welding. This step was crucial to prevent the ring's inner diameter from expanding. After completing the weld on the outer side of the crack, the mechanic reinforced the retaining ring by adding a thick iron block as a support rib. After the alignment was correct, one end of the iron block was fixed. Due to its high hardness, the mechanic heated oxyacetylene before shaping it to improve its alignment with the side. Halfway through shaping the iron block, the mechanic added welds to the seam to secure the fit. This ensured that there would be no issues even after the iron block cooled. On the other side, before the iron block was fully fitted, clamps were used to press it into place until no gaps remained between it and the housing. A hammer was then used to finalize the fit of the iron block. Next, the mechanic performed a full weld using a welding rod. Even though the tools were simple, the repair results were far from basic. Since only the surface had been welded, the mechanic addressed the remaining risks by welding the inner cracks, ensuring that the inner welds could bear the load. The internal welds were completed with the mechanic's skilled operation, but the hole diameter was still too large for the bearing. To ensure a proper fit, the entire housing was mounted on a lathe, allowing the inner wall to be machined. However, because the differential housing is irregular, the mechanic had to adjust the alignment repeatedly to avoid errors during cutting. After ensuring everything was aligned, the mechanic used a dull tool to remove the irregularities in the inner wall. Even though the welded inner ring was not perfectly round, the lathe's cutting process restored it to the correct shape. The mechanic then tested the fit with a factory standard bearing. Once the roundness was verified, the mechanic used an outside micrometer to measure the bearing's diameter and replicated those dimensions on a gauge, which would be used to check the housing's hole diameter for any discrepancies. After confirming there were no errors, the mechanic used a welding rod to add more material to the inner wall. This process reduced the hole's diameter and increased the strength of the welded bearing retaining ring. Thanks to the mechanic's expert welding, the added material on the inner wall was quickly completed. Finally, the mechanic used a dull tool to machine away any uneven welds, cutting the inner wall to the correct diameter based on the previously measured data. After repeated comparisons with the gauge, the mechanic installed the bearing for a test. The cracked differential housing was successfully repaired once the bearing was perfectly aligned and its rotation was not hindered. So, what do you think of the craftsmanship of the Pakistani mechanic who repaired this differential housing? If you were to rate it out of 10, how many points would you give?